Hey guys, this is Tyler here, and I'm going to discuss here why women often make really bad CEOs or presidents of companies. Okay, so most of us are familiar with cases like Marissa Mayer, who was the former CEO of Yahoo, and she was actually the last CEO of this company, and she started at this company which was relatively strong and essentially drove it into the ground. It made a whole string of very terrible investments, terrible executive decisions, bad hiring practices, and just pouring money into a lot of kind of like pet projects and a lot of like micromanaging, not really looking at the big picture of what she was doing, leading a multi-billion-dollar major tech company. And this situation is very synonymous with women CEOs and presidents of companies. You see this all over the world. It's very common. And yes, there are absolutely exceptions where there are women that successfully can run a company. They understand how this should be done. But those are typically the anomalies. The norm is for them to take a company and drive it into the ground, especially if it wasn't the company they built up. If it was like a company they just took over, this is often the case. And also know, most women, even who are classified as owners of companies, typically they co-found the company with at least one or two other people, typically men, who were very important to making this operation successful. It's very rare to read cases or stories where it was a single woman that built the company and led it and grew it into something big, massive. This almost never happens. There are some rare exceptions, but usually there's someone there, or they may not even be listed. They may not be technically classified as the co-founder, but it was very critical to build the enterprise, and it's usually a guy in this case. But in this situation, though, these women executives, CEOs, they run companies or presidents, and it often is a recipe for disaster. And this is across many different industries and sectors. I mean, it could be entertainment, technology, logistics, education, anything. There's many other areas I didn't list here. These are just example areas. We see the same thing over and over often. And the company still may be doing well. They may not like necessarily drive the company into the ground, but they're still often a bad CEO or a bad president. Because the company could still do well, even if they do have like a bad CEO or bad president. If they have good like other C-level executives, and if they're more of just like a figurehead for the company, which is sometimes the case, sometimes CEOs are just more figureheads, it's not going to make a big difference. Whereas there's other companies in enterprises where it's extremely important, the person who's at the helm, especially when we look at smaller or medium enterprises where they do have a lot of day-to-day involvement in the operation. We see this so with women when they're in these very high level positions, and they often just they don't do a very good job. One of the first reasons why I think is the fact that they tend to micromanage and nitpick at little things rather than have a macro perspective. There's of course the need to have attention to detail, to focus on little things when it's combined with the big picture. If it's a conjoined view and it plays a role into the big picture, it's important. But there's other times focusing, nitpicking on very little things is unnecessary, and it's not what a CEO should be doing. At the very least, should have people below them that are tackling these problems or issues. They shouldn't be involved in these type of areas, because often they're wasting their like time and energy into things that aren't important for the larger perspective or operation of the enterprise. That big picture is obviously what actually enables the enterprise to be successful and to continue being successful and growing in the future. And that's usually how it works. But when you have someone that's just focusing on very little details, and these aren't necessarily even important small details, obviously it diverts attention from the overall happenings and and how the company on a bigger picture is performing. And there were many accounts with Marissa Myers in the case of Yahoo. I mean, it's very difficult because a lot of the media was mainstream media that covered this situation, but there was some input and insight from guys that were also C-level executives who were engineers who had like face-to-face encounters with her, and they all consistently said she was terrible. She was just a horrible CEO, and she was very like condescending, very disrespectful. She made a whole slew of terrible investments. There's actually was a year where there was a huge number of investments that Yahoo made in all these like startups, or these were acquisitions, and most of these actually eventually folded, or they ended up being bad acquisitions. They didn't produce a lot of value for the company. We all know what happened. Eventually Yahoo was sold. Of course, Marissa Mayer got like she had her golden parachute. I mean, she sucked millions out of the company for her own personal gain, and also when she left the company, of course, got a massive exit package. But this was just rewarding bad behavior here, or you could also say bad performance. What we saw with her, though, is consistent in other industries or in the same industry when you have women that's at the helm of the company. When men are at the helm of a company, I think they tend to have they're less condescending. They tend to be more big picture minded. They also do understand the importance of details, but those smaller details are only important if they tie into the big picture for the CEO to be handling. Otherwise, they should probably have someone else handling those smaller details. That's not their responsibility. Another problem is that women are often at the helm of these companies, and it's not uncommon for them to not actually have industry experience in that area, especially when we look at the growing technology sectors, engineering sectors. There's cases where they've never had like an engineering degree. They've never actually worked in hands-on type of areas of this industry. All they've done is basically like the business side. So they don't really have actual experience in that area, performing tasks of that area. And so when it comes to driving like science decisions or engineering decisions, it's usually very terrible like foresight. I actually knew of a case here like in Estonia where this woman was leading a company here, like a medium-sized tech company, and she decided to eliminate one of their divisions. It was like a more experimental, but it was actually the area that actually really enticed investors and people to the company. I believe it was in cloud storage, or it was AI. I can't remember. It was one of the two. She decided to just totally scrap this segment of the company. And as you would expect, that was a terrible decision. This was like a couple of years ago. From that point, the company really started taking a hit. And this was a bad decision because even though, yes, it wasn't making a profit at the moment, it was more experimental. This is the area that really attracted people, investors, and even customers, clients. This area, though, this was part of the big picture here, and this is where I've said this, you'll understand the big picture. This isn't like running a little like cafe or convenience store. Not that those are bad businesses. This is more complex. Also requires to understand how important that technology that probably eventually will produce profit for the company, and being able to also look ahead, not just looking at the present moment. That's one of the big problems with women CEOs and presidents is they look very present-minded. They don't think in the future and kind of anticipate down the road. You look at a guy like Elon Musk, prime example. He is so keen at looking so far out, so many years ahead, and we saw that with Tesla and his space company and his solar company. You can see this. He has this sort of intuition to look many years ahead. And this is hardly found at all in women CEOs and presidents. And the other thing also is that when there's like personal problems or personnel problems within companies or just among their peers, they often don't get along too well, whether it's like C-level executives or it's with employees, it's with like engineers. It can be anyone. And often, like I mentioned before, very condescending, or they get into little petty, like, kind of clashes with people. If they don't like something, it may not just be professional, maybe a personal thing they don't like, and then they may fire them or something. This is not uncommon. It's very, like, kind of high school minded. It's very, like, drama minded. And it's interesting too, because people are told a lot how women have really good, like, interpersonal and social skills, and I often see the behaviors and actions of them, like, in these corporate areas, and I very much doubt that. I don't see where people get that kind of determination from, because there are some exceptions, but it's not often, I don't believe, the case. Very good at manipulating people, or kind of more of these dark triad traits, but when it comes to actual, like verbal acumen, like conflict resolution and other, like, higher verbal skills, I actually see quite the opposite. I think guys generally tend to be better in that area when you look at the bell curve. And also, anyone knows, like, in a CEO position, when you're in this area, you have a team of people. You have to rely extensively and put a lot of trust and faith in the executives around you and other higher level employees, because you can't manage all of this on your own. You really have to put a lot of reliance in other people, and also you have to get, like, expertise often. You're not going to be the expert of all areas. If it's within a science-based area or engineering, especially if it's an area that's evolving, it could be quite different when you were hands-on working in this field 10 years before, and then we're being an executive presently. It could be very different. These areas evolve often. Women often have a very hard time accepting, like, input and expertise of other of team members and other people, especially if they're below them. They don't often like to listen to them. This is a big problem. You have to have a level of modesty and humbleness to listen to people and to execute based on the guidance that you're given. Put trust in people, respect people, all of these things. These are often areas that really make some of the best CEOs. Another interesting thing that you see often, and this is kind of relates to, like, inclusion and diversity, is that when women run the show, often there's actually a lot, like, lack of inclusion and diversity. I recall, like, Huffington Post, like, the major people that were running the company, there was, like, a picture, and, like, every single person was, like, a white woman, all but one or two. It was like 10 or 12 of the main people. There were, like, no guys. And this is another thing, is that often women prefer hiring other women in, like, high level roles, and they will put as many as they can alongside them. They actually are very non-inclusive with whether it's men, or sometimes even across, like, the ethnic groups. If they're of one ethnic group, they prefer hiring women of that same ethnic group. It's actually very like this kind of in-group preference behavior, and you see this very often with companies have a woman CEO. Within 5 years, there's going to be a lot of other women in, like, high-level positions. Obviously, intentionally excluding very highly qualified men from these jobs, from these roles, just so that they can have all of these seats at the top. Another thing is, like, an inability to see and be patient with employees or colleagues that have huge potential, because sometimes people obviously have kind of a slower start whenever they start working for a company. Like myself, for example, when I first started working at UPS several years ago, in my first, like, few months, I had 2 times where I was really close to being fired, and I was able to just hang on, like, dearly to my job at the time. I eventually got a promotion, but it was really difficult, and I was very fortunate because all the management at that time, all the, like, the people calling the shots where I worked at my facility, they were all men, all guys, and they were willing to, and they saw the potential that I had and the value that I could provide the company with. And often I think they see, like, you see this with from a lower level, managerial level, like, to the top CEO level, that these women often they aren't willing to see like potential and be patient and be willing to give a new hiree like a shot with, and because they may in fact just be a bit rusty in the beginning, and then over time as they grow into the role they can actually become one of the best employees of that enterprise. And this is often a big problem. It's often more the here and now, kind of similar to the previous point that I made with like investment in projects, and it's very much based on here and now. It's not based on like long-term forecasts like we see with the Japanese. The Japanese are very smart, intuitive in this sense. They look many years out with like companies like making investments, evaluating like decisions. And this is really important. You have to think obviously also like in scale. If you're really going to scale an enterprise or operation, you have to be very both big picture and small picture when it's in context with the big picture. This is often very challenging with women. Obviously too, as I mentioned, it's kind of that micromanaging part of it, and often micromanaging like the areas with the least value that don't actually have a lot of impact on the bottom line of the company. Another problem you see this is I recall with this whole Theranos situation with homes. I think of that expression, fake it till you make it. But I think often with the women it's like fake it but never produce, like never show the real goods, never actually show like something legitimate product, legit service, totally misleading investors and other like customers and your company. And this story, I mean, very famous. She was totally misleading investors, and she probably could have modified the product a little and produced something that they were actually capable of producing legitimately, but she didn't. She was just out there to milk these investors as much as she could, and obviously now she's facing some serious prison time. I think she actually will get a pretty serious prison sentence because what she did, of course, was like fraud. It was on the same scale as like a Ponzi scheme, and this Holmes really displays just like all those like traits of a terrible CEO, and especially a woman CEO. And this kind of also relates to a previous point, but like in her case, as with other women CEOs, not being able to divide like looking at the person like in a personal sense compared to like a professional sense. And this is a big problem because you can dislike someone on a personal level, but they can be very good professional at what they do. There were people I used to work with. I did not care for them personally, but they were very good at what they did professionally. They were very like systematic. They had very good like spatial acumen, guys I used to work with. This is important. This is something I think one of the biggest struggles of like women CEOs, that they just have a hard time. If they don't personally like someone, they'll take it out against them on the professional level, even if they're very talented at what they do professionally. And sometimes they'll like fire them. You saw this with Holmes. She wouldn't like someone on a personal level, and then she would just fire them, even though they could professionally handle their job very well. And this is a terrible trait. If you're any leader in a company, you have to be willing to look past the personal. If it's look at the professional talent, look at the actual traits that person brings to the table. That's what's going to make the enterprise more successful. And being able to look past that is really important. You need to surround yourself based on people's skills, professional skills, not on their personal traits. And that's what's most important. These are all things, all problems I see often with women CEOs. And yes, there are exceptions, but those often aren't the norm. So give me your feedback below, and thank you.